Hello, my name is Roisin and welcome back to my channel. In today's video, I'm going to talk to you about 10 books that I think you should know about, but you probably haven't heard of, except maybe on this channel. And the reason I think you may not have heard of them is that every single book on this list has less than 1,000 ratings on Goodreads. Some of them have less than 100 ratings on Goodreads, so they are definitely lesser known books. They are, I think, mostly books that I have spoken about though, so there is a chance that if you watch all of my videos, you will have heard of them. But regardless, I think they are very good books and that deserve a wider readership. So the first is one that I read this year and I have been trying to get other people to read all year, and that is The Betrayed by Riene Akake Melvin. This is a proof and the actual cover looks more like this, but I read this book earlier this year and I absolutely loved it. It is a piece of fiction set in the Philippines. It's about two sisters, Lila and Pilar, and Lila's husband, whose name is Arturo. Lila and Pilar's father was an activist who spoke out against the reign of Duterte, and so they'd had to flee the Philippines and live in San Francisco. But their father is assassinated and Duterte's reign ends, and so they end up going back. Arturo was Duterte's godson and is getting back involved in politics at the beginning of this book, which, although it is fairly chunky, it spans the course of only a few months. Lila is pregnant with her and Arturo's first child, and Pilar is also in love with Arturo, so there are fairly complex family relationships followed in here. We follow them as they are newly arrived in the Philippines, and Arturo is trying to become a politician, and we see Pilar become more and more obsessed with Arturo, and Lila slowly detach from him. The Philippines is in a state of upheaval, and there have been 6 attempted coups against the new regime, and we see the ways that Arturo involved in politics shows us the ways that politics are not that different in the Philippines from what they had been. It's a very slow-moving book and a really, really atmospheric one. Lali sees ghosts. She's haunted by the ghost that she thinks is her father and other ghosts she sees throughout as well. And there are elements of Philippine folklore weaved throughout the text. We see them as they journey through Manila, life in Manila, where there are various different signs and portents of the future, and as they travel further outwards to different islands of the Philippines. Pilar accompanying Arturo on his political tour, and Lali trying to find something to grasp onto. There isn't a huge amount of plot in this book, although it does ramp up and there is a huge amount of tension towards the end as well. We see the slow unravelling of this family and of the Philippines as things come to a head. It's the Marcos dictatorship. It's not the end of Duterte. Duterte has just finished. It's the end of the Marcos dictatorship. My apologies. I have misspoken. This is a really interesting, slow-moving book that explores the political landscape of the Philippines, the culture of the Philippines, and the falling apart and the fragments of this family, the secrets that they are hiding from each other, and the ghosts of the past that haunt them. Next, a piece of non-fiction that I read when I was reading the Wainwright Prize for Fiction, and this is On Gallows Down by Nicola Chester. It is a part memoir, part nature writing that follows Nicola Chester's experience growing up near the Grenfell Common protests against the nuclear weapons that the Americans were storing in Britain at the time, and the camp that was made up mostly of women and children. We also follow her as she protests against the building of an M3 bypass that's going through an area of outstanding natural beauty. It's an area of outstanding natural beauty and scientific interest, as she tries to save trees and recognises the birds of her native home, her hearing the cuckoo every spring. We also follow her relationship with a big country estate on which she ends up living because of her husband's job, her uneasy relationship with the locals, and her own becoming a mother, and her feelings about raising children in this world. She links her own experience of life and her own experience of the landscape with the history and the past of what had gone on, including things like the enclosures of the common land. It's a really, really interesting book about disconnecting from nature and her own connection to it, about trying to rewild an area, and about fighting against the capitalist forces intent on destroying nature. Part memoir, as I said, but part political as well, and the way that she weaves together these stories of what happened in the past in this area, the way that she's so focused on place and on rural living, which I think is something that I haven't read a lot of non-fiction on, but I enjoyed her look at it and her own family's difficulties and her fighting with the people, trying to get them to live in a more sustainable way, the ways that she is tricked and humoured. It is really beautifully written and really kind of a melancholy, gorgeous piece of writing that pulled me on and really brought the landscape itself to life. And I love the way that she wove in history and politics. I thought that it worked really well. Earlier this year I read Keeping the House by T.J. Chin, and this is one that I've seen have quite mixed reactions from the few people that I have seen reviewed it, but it is a book that I absolutely loved. It is set in North London in a Turkish Cypriot community, set between family parties and back bedrooms and corner shops and the parks in between council blocks of flats. The basic story is that one of our main characters' partners has gone to prison, but there is a load of heroin in Turkey that he needs to smuggle into the UK, and so his partner takes over that smuggling and gets involved in this underground drug ring of North London Turkish Cypriots. But we also follow her daughter and her daughter's experience of growing up, going to school, and her relationship with this culture, her experience of boys and sexual harassment and of creepy older men and of things falling apart around her. And it's quite humorous. There's a lot of warmth and funny and humour in between these characters. I feel like all the characters themselves are really well built up, and it's written in such an interesting way. The actual text will have words in Turkish and then the translation like squeezed into the gaps between the lines as if someone has annotated the book. But the way that it flows together, it feels really seamless and really immersive in this culture. I think it is a really wonderfully visual book, a book that where you can see the corner shop and where you know kind of the feeling of all of the places that they are, all of these parks and darker corners that I think it's so wonderfully evoked. There is, as I said, a lot of humour. It's kind of ridiculous and slapstick almost. I can see it very much being a TV series. There is that humour that feels like Derry Girls and like is it Four Lions? There's that kind of vibe to it where everything is a bit ridiculous and humorous, but there is darker, more intense stuff going on underneath the surface. Lyrically written as well, so wonderful, and it flashes back and forward in time without giving you any kind of hint as to when you are or who you're with. So it can take a lot of getting used to. It's kind of a jostling book. But one of the things I loved it for was that it showed a London that I recognised. I was born and raised in London, and I feel like a lot of literature in London is about middle class people in the centre of town, which is nothing like my experience growing up in South East London, and is nothing like T.J. Chin and this experience either. Though my experience is also nothing like this, I just felt like it really got into the actual culture of London in a way that I feel like a lot of books don't. A classic that I read this year is East Goes West by Jung-Hil Kang, and this is the first piece of literature published by a Korean American writer, and it tells the story of a young Korean man who turns up in America in the early 20th century. He has been in prison in Japan, and he has come to America to make a new life for himself and to go to university, and he arrives in New York and is instantly swept off to Chinatown, where he does also speak Chinese and where he meets the Asian American people. He's kind of a warmless character, someone who doesn't seem to really understand what's going on, which allows for a lot of humour because he has kind of a interesting turn of phrase, and we can see the ways that he is being tricked by people and being taken advantage of. He is taken advantage of a lot by the people around him who take him in to be basically like an indentured servant almost in a lot of different situations, but he almost always seems to pull through. He's very interested in literature, and it's kind of a kinetic, fast-paced book. Even though there's such a lot to it, it's all of these little vignettes really linked together in such a speedy way. I think it feels like the pace of a much shorter novel, but extended over a long period of time. It's very interesting to read a sort of 20s, 30s novel from an entirely different perspective from that I have ever read from before from an American novelist. It is exploring a different aspect of the culture and race relations and New York, a different part of New York than I feel like is in a lot of classics, this sort of Chinatown New York and the immigrant experience as well. It is written very much in a style of a lot of 20s and 30s novels, although I feel like there's a lot more verbosity than in other books of the time period. It feels like our main character is kind of a thinly veiled Jung-Hil Kang himself. His biography is very similar to that of the author, and so it's kind of like he's gently mocking himself, which I quite enjoyed. I think it was a really interesting experience reading this, and I think it's a classic that more people should read. Next, a modern classic, I suppose, of Kazakhstani writing, and that is The Dead Wander in the Desert by Roland Seisenbaev. I read this book last year and it was one of my favourite books that I read last year. It is another epic, long, chunky book, which definitely tells me that I should probably read more long, chunky books. And it's one that I don't know anyone else who has read. Giant Inland Sea. It's a salinated lake in Kazakhstan where there are a lot of communities built up around it, fishing communities that base their income and their livelihoods off of this lake. Further up in Uzbekistan, the Soviets have blocked off the lake, building dams to irrigate fields in Uzbekistan. And this has caused the lake to become more and more salty and to dry up, which means that the fish are dying. The people around the edges of the lake are losing their livelihood. On top of this, the Soviets have been using what they consider empty land in Kazakhstan to test nuclear weapons. And so there is a lot of illness, a lot of cancer and birth deformities. It's a story that we follow one man and his son as they go to Moscow and try and find some help for this community, and also as they study and learn about Russian history and culture and the way their own culture is sublimated to this. Kazakhstan had a lot of had a nomadic culture, and so there was oral storytelling tradition, and there was a lot of oral storytelling woven into this as well, a lot of lamentations and repetitions, and I really like that style. I think it works particularly well for this kind of book that is a big lamentation for a loss of land and a loss of people, because the way that the Soviet rule has kind of destroyed Kazakhstan. Really beautifully written, and it starts off with a group of children. They're on a school trip to this lake, and their teacher starts to tell them a story, and this is where the story kind of weaves out of. Incredibly beautiful, and it really wraps you up. It does remind me of some of the other Russian classics I've read, in that we are ostensibly following the story of this father and his son, but there are so many other characters, and it really is a story of Kazakhstan in a time period. I think it's wonderful, and definitely one that I think more people should read if you like Russian literature, if you like epic books, if you like looks at empire. I think that The Dead Wander in the Desert by Roland Seisenbaev is one that you need to read. In a different direction, Crow Court by Andy Charman is another book that I read last year that I really loved. I found like it was really a witty and humorous and really well written book. And I was surprised that not more people had picked it up, to be honest. So this is set in a small town in Dorset in the early 19th century, or maybe it's like the 1840s, the early Victorian period, and a young boy turns up dead. He's committed suicide, and then the choirmaster goes missing, and there is a mystery about this choirmaster, something that is making the boys afraid of him. We don't know why he has disappeared or what has happened. It is told in these various different chapters that all come from a different perspective as we go through the decades, and this mystery is slowly uncovered as to what happens to the choirmaster, why this young boy killed himself, and the fallout of that. It is told in such an interesting way because each of these different chapters from different perspectives are told in almost a different style as well. So the first chapter is told from no perspective, and it almost reads like a play, and it really sets the scene of all of these characters. We have the Reverend of the parish and his kind of gothic story of the crows who are watching him. We have one of the men who ends up on a ship, and it's kind of like an epic adventure story. We have a story of a little boy who gets himself into a huge amount of trouble dreaming himself to be in an adventure story. There is a story of actors travelling that is a comedy of manners, story of a man who goes to see a woman who is a worker, and we see the Luddite movement and the workers' rights of the time period. It's almost Dickensian in that section. Interesting way to build out a mystery and to build out a story that I think is very gripping and at the same time intellectually stimulating, because it's told from all these different styles. It is one that I think had so much charm, wit to it, and at the same time so much skill. If you like historical fiction, you like a bit of a mystery, you like something a bit gothic, I think you would enjoy this. It's kind of humorous, and it definitely reads like a 19th century novel in certain parts of it, but there is more to it than that. It's a very smart book, and I really enjoyed it. A very dark book that I really enjoyed that I read last year is House of Stone by Novuo Rosa Teshuma, and this is a book set in Zimbabwe about the history of Robert Mugabe's rise to power. And it is set at the point of the 2007 moments of uprising against Robert Mugabe. The son of this family have gone missing, and his parents don't know what's happened to him. They have a lodger who's been living in granny annex kind of situation, and knows something, but he's not telling. And he uses his position within his family to kind of ingratiate himself and get closer to the two the mother and the father of this family, relating slowly over the course of time his own story and drawing out from them their stories as well. And it is in the relating of these stories that we see the history of Zimbabwe as it moved towards independence. A really, really dark book, really dark. Like if you need trigger warnings, look them up, kind of dark. The two older people through the 70s and 80s and this younger man through the 90s and the 2000s. And it moves so seamlessly back and forth through these different characters' perspectives. Really tense and a kind of very page-turnery book, but it was also really, really beautiful on a sentence-to-sentence level. There is such wondrous use of language in this book, and I really enjoy the way Schumer writes. There is such a rhythm to it and a kind of a horror feeling inside as you are like drawn on. You can't stop turning the pages, but you want the book to end at the same time. So in that way it does feel like a horror novel, even though what it is historical fiction and it is true to what people actually experienced. It is also very much an unreliable narrator, an unlikable narrator as well. This main character who is hiding something from his family and who is trying to ingratiate himself with them is really, really unlikable, really manipulative, untrustworthy, and so trying to believe him and his perspective is difficult, but Tashuma allows us enough distance from him to be able to see and understand him at the same time. It's a really, again, quite a complicated novel. There's quite a lot going on, but the power of the narrative and the beauty of the writing draw you on and compel you to keep reading the book. Another piece of African fiction is The Death of Comrade President by Alain Mabanko, and this is set in the Republic of the Congo, and so this is the 1970s when it is a communist country, told from the perspective of this little boy, and it is told over the course of 3 days when there is a military coup to overthrow the leader. So we see this little boy the day before the coup, when he doesn't know anything's going to happen, and we see he builds up a picture of his life, of his living with his mother and uncle. I can't quite remember the relationship of the people he lives with, playing with children in the street and going to the market and becoming obsessed with this one small dog. In doing so, he talks to us about school and he talks about the indoctrination into communism and the supreme leader kind of feeling, the songs they've learnt, the way they've learnt about history and the way they've learnt about other countries, and it brings that all in a very smooth way. It's quite funny and charming. I think if you don't like child narrators, generally speaking, this one definitely won't be for you, because there's a lot of like childish humour and repetition of his own jokes that he really finds amusing, but those things do turn over the course of the book in a direction that you are not expecting. And then the coup happens, and there is the second day, which is this boy basically sitting in a room as adults talk, and he doesn't quite understand what's going on. He doesn't know his own relationship to the leader, and slowly unfurl the things that happened over the course of the coup as these four adults talk to one another. And this leads in the end to a really... The ending is just intense, and definitely don't want to spoil anything for you, but it is worth getting through this book that feels... It's not difficult to get through, it's a really interesting book, but it does feel like you can't quite see where it's going, and the ending really just brings everything together. It's really well done. It builds a very visual feeling again, which is something that I love in books. It is not a very action-packed book. You have to read between the lines to build what is going on, and I think it does give you the perfect amount of information where you can see what's happening, but you don't see quite clearly, you see through the eyes of a child. And a collection of short stories that I really enjoyed is A Registry of My Passage Upon the Earth by Daniel Mason. This is a collection of historical fiction short stories, although there are some sort of fabulous elements thrown in there as well. And each of these stories is historical fiction, but it is in a slightly different genre. And I love the way that Daniel Mason can play with genre, and the way that each of his stories feel very immersed in the genre that he is slotting them into, but they are all so powerful. A woman trying to look after her son, and they construct a glass carriage to travel him through the smog of London, which is just such a wonderful image. There is a story of these telephone operators in the Brazilian jungle, and the slow creeping darkness of not hearing, they don't see anyone. For days at a time they're on their own in this jungle, and the only connection they have to the outside world is they're speaking on the radio to each other, and when someone stops answering, what's going on. There is another one of a hot air balloonist, an aerialist, which I thought was quite fantastical, and I really enjoyed it. And there is a almost Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde kind of horror story of this man riding a horse through the German forests and talking through his life, and had an element of the fairy tale to it. It's so wonderful how each of the stories are so contained, and they all also kind of bring a magic to them as well. I thought it was a really visual collection of short stories, and I really am impressed when someone can build a world in such a short space of time without needing like pages and pages of info dumping or pages and pages of description. He just builds the worlds and the characters so succinctly, and I think it's because he's building them alongside real worlds, but his just come to life, and I really enjoyed the magic of his writing. I thought it was wonderful. And then the final one on this list is another classic, and that is Rubens by Amy Levy. And if you like Victorian novels, I really think you should read this one. This is set in the was published in the 1880s, and it's set, I think, in a similar time period, and it is about a family of well-off Jewish Londoners, and we follow their younger son, Rubens, as he returns from Australia, where he's been sent for his health, as he had kind of a mental breakdown, and he returns, and he is the hope of this family. They want him to be a politician, and they want him to marry well, but he is in love with his cousin's cousin, and there is the relationship between him and his cousin's cousin, who are in love with one another, and she is not well off, and her family are too Jewish. So they are all Jewish, obviously, but him and his family are more like cosmopolitan and more integrated into London society, and there are connections between them and kind of the landed gentry. My neighbour is sawing something. I'm gonna have to pop with the saw because we're gonna lose the light. They are kind of being more integrated into London society, like I said, and he is planning to become an MP. Her family still speak Yiddish to one another, and they are considered like uncouth and uncultured and also too Jewish. And it is an exploration of a culture, a very specific culture of London Jewish people, of upper middle class London Jewish people, and their relationships with one another. And apparently a lot of Jewish people of the time didn't like it because she was showing what they did behind closed doors in front of everyone, basically. So she was talking about the way that they talk to one another, and she was, in the introduction to this, it talks about how the gradations of Jewishness and class and the judging that happens within a culture, but you present a united front to those outside of the culture because of the anti-Semitism of London at the time, and how she was foiling that. Anyway, it's a really interesting book. Very short, very readable, really very readable for a classic. I think I whizzed through it. Like, as I said, it's short, but also it's very compelling and very readable. It doesn't feel archaic at all, and I really enjoyed it. Those are 10 books that you may not have heard about that I think more people should read. So if you do read them, let me know in the comments down below. And if there are any books that you love that you don't think get enough hype, let me know those as well too. I think I'm going to film the reverse of this, which is books I love that have a lot of hype. So look out for that video in the future, and subscribe if you would like to see it. Remember to give this video a thumbs up if you liked it, and I will see you again very soon as I put out new videos twice a week. Thank you for watching. Bye bye.